Hi everyone, this is Natraj. I'm back again with another video after a long gap, and this time I'm going to show you how to use Azure Static Web Apps. Back in the days of Dynamics CRM, it was sort of like not necessary to go outside of the bounds of Dynamics. All you had to do was explore what is available on the Dynamics ecosystem, and at the maximum, you probably would have some web resources that called some third-party APIs or write plugin codes. But since Dynamics CRM transformed into Dynamics 365, and then it also became the Power Platform. Now Dataflex Pro, it is more, I think it is becoming more and more the boundary between um, Azure and Power Platform is becoming more and more blurred. So I think from a personal perspective, it is important to learn what is available on the Azure stack. So that we will know when we develop solutions, we can develop something that is totally integrated and not just rely on what is in the Power Platform ecosystem. So if you are a techie or if you are like a developer, it is actually good to explore what is actually coming up on the Microsoft Azure ecosystem. I have been playing around with Azure Static Web Apps for the past couple of months, and I thought it's good to share what I know so far so that you can also leverage on my experience. You can the documentation is quite good, so you can have a look at the documentation as well. But there are some things that are not covered in the documentation, just like dev containers and things like that. So I will show you in this video. I'll show you how to actually use dev containers so that you can rapidly build your static web apps. So now let's explore what we are going to see in this video. So first, introduction to Azure Static Web Apps, and then we will just learn how to set up a dev environment, because usually when we want to set up our dev environment, in traditionally when we do Dynamics or Power Apps development, we would just install a whole bunch of SDKs, assemblies, and npm packages. A lot of times with that, you'll have some version mismatch or some dependency mismatch or some prerequisites that are not installed. It's just a whole lot of mess. So rather than just installing everything locally on our environment, let's use Docker and dev containers, so that we'll have all our the whole development environment is containerized. And Visual Studio Code has an extension called remote containers that helps you to seamlessly develop on source code that is actually inside the container. And also it actually behaves as if it's on your local machine, so you wouldn't have any problem committing your source into GitHub or anything like that. It is just as if the code is in your local machine, even though it is running inside a container. And when you're running code inside a container, you have to open up certain ports to kind of facilitate that when you are doing some local development. Otherwise, if the server is running on port 5500 inside the container, you wouldn't be able to reach that port unless you configure that port mapping sort of thing. So we also need to know that. And the next is like configuration, that is like how to set up the routes in using a config file. And if you have some application settings, some secrets, connection strings, things like that, how do you set it up? And next thing is authentication. Authentication as in, if you have the static web app hosted publicly, you don't want, and if that site is connecting to a CDS API, you don't want anyone to just get access to the site. You just want to restrict it to only people inside your AD. So how do you kind of put up a authentication page in front of it so that not everyone can access that confidential information. How do you kind of set it up? And lastly, in this video, I will show you also how to connect to CDS API. So that means we need to configure Azure AD and register the app so that we can use an application user to connect to CDS. So how do you actually set it up? I will also go through that. And finally, how do you deploy this whole thing to Azure so that people can access the site? So let's start with the introduction. What is Azure Static Web Apps? So if you go to this documentation site, there is a diagram which explains what exactly is a static web apps. My understanding initially when I heard this term static was that it is some sort of built pages that sort of like a that's served on like a that's served without any sort of API or anything like that. That was my sort of my understanding initially before I actually explored it a little bit more. But what it is you have the static content, that is the HTML and JavaScript, all that static content. So normally, like that is not what static web apps is. It's just not HTML and JavaScript. It's just like a static site, whatever people just like they don't have any sort of interactivity or anything. You just have a bunch of pages, and you just need a server to store all those pages and serve it on the web. So that is that was sort of what I thought was static, like the static part of it. But that is not like Azure Static Web Apps. You have still an interactivity, as in like an API layer where the HTML page will be still able to call this API that could do anything in terms of like data that it retrieves or whatever response it returns. So when we say static web apps, it doesn't mean that there is no interactivity. It doesn't mean that this whole website is a bunch of static HTML pages that with pre-built content. It could be interactive. It could be doing API calls on page loads, things like that. So that is the first like sort of misconception I had about static web apps. So now let's first thing before we dive in, we also will first quickly look at what are the limitations of a static web apps, considering that it's still in preview, so this might change in the future. But as of today, that is August 2020, when you develop, so like I said, when you have a static web app, you have a static part, that is HTML, and then you have the dynamic part, that is the Azure function. So in the dynamic part, that's Azure function, we are limited to using only TypeScript and JavaScript. So in the end, it's JavaScript anyway, because TypeScript will compile into JavaScript. You can't use C# or F# or anything like that. At the moment, you can only use your API can only use can only be a TypeScript or a JavaScript app. So that is the limitation. But I'm like I'm more comfortable in TypeScript and JavaScript than C#, so I don't really find this a big limitation for me. But a lot of people who are used to writing C# in Azure functions might find it a bit tricky to build their functions in TypeScript. So that is the first limitation. And second limitation in terms of authentication, in your when you actually build Azure function, you can set up managed identity on that function. So when you connect to some service like some API like Dynamics or Power Apps, you will be connecting using that managed identity. But in the API that you build in the Azure Static Web Apps, you can't run that API as managed identity. So there are two limitations as of today. One is you can use only TypeScript or JavaScript on your functions, that is the API. And second, the API cannot run in managed identity. you need to use a service account to actually execute the to connect to some API like Dynamics or Power Apps that we'll see in this demo. Now let's compare Azure Static Web Apps against static website hosting in Azure Blobs. So Azure Blob also is a storage mechanism. You can store HTML, JavaScript, CSS, images, whatever it is, on blob storage, and in the end you will still get a website. And what is the difference between setting it up this way versus static web apps? With static web apps, when you do a branch from the main, like if you have, assuming that you have your repo in GitHub, you create a new branch and then you make some changes and then you push the branch into GitHub, and straight away in the GitHub workflow, the action will actually create a staging environment for you automatically, and that's really useful if you want to test your site before actually publishing it into the main branch. That is really useful. And in terms of authentication, it is really easy to put up a authentication system in front of static web apps. Like you'd use Azure AD, you could use Gmail, you could use GitHub, and there are a whole bunch of identity providers in static web apps. In that front, it is also really easy to do that authentication piece, and both the function as well as the HTML are bundled together in just like one sort of big giant application. So that is like really cohesive, I guess. And right out of the box, you also get the GitHub workflow, so you don't need to worry about the CI/CD kind of thing. Like it's already all configured. When you create a new static web apps, you already get all this configuration out of the box, so it's really easy to start building your code and deploy them. So these are the two differences that I encountered. So the next step is to install Docker. If I want to give a quick summary of what Docker is, it's sort of like a virtual machine, but it's not really a virtual machine. But if I just want to simplify it just for an understanding perspective, you could sort of consider it sort of a virtual machine, and you actually build all your code and all the development tools and everything is inside a container that is running inside a virtual machine. So that's not a very accurate definition, but that's something that will help you to understand what exactly is Docker. It's not like a full-fledged VM. Like usually when we were back in like the on-prem CRM days, we would be running for exploration and for learning. We would be running the CRM server inside a virtual box, a full-blown virtual machine. The virtual machine itself will take like 2 to 5 minutes to start, and then the whole kind of like copying between the virtual machine and the host machine. There are a lot of like painful things to kind of encounter when you are using a virtual machine. But Docker is not as heavy as a virtual machine. It's sort of a emulation. Yeah, I don't really know how to explain it without confusing, but just think it as a virtual machine, like so. And then you need, in order to install Docker, you need to find the right version, if you are using Windows, yeah, just download Docker for Windows. If you're a Mac, then you have different clients, so you can download the right version for it. And then after you install Docker desktop, you have an option for setting the engine. So you can run the Hyper-V engine, or you can run the WSL2 engine. I have a fast ring Windows 10, so I have chosen WSL2. It's heaps faster than Hyper-V based engine. And the difference in Hyper-V based engine is when you use the Hyper-V backend, you have to set up the mapping of your local drives to the Docker container. But with the WSL2 based engine, you don't need to do any of that. It sort of works right out of the box. So since I am using Windows 2004, I think 2004, yeah, see, you need to have Windows 10 version 2004, then you will be able to use WSL2 backend. So I have installed that. So first install Docker on your desktop. So after installing Docker, next you have to install this extension called remote containers. It's a VS Code extension. We are going to be doing all our static web apps development inside VS Code, and since we are going to be doing that inside a Docker container, we need to install this extension called remote containers, and we'll be using dev containers to actually do our development. And the cool thing about dev containers is once you install this extension, you can install other VS Code extension inside the container, and when you run VS Code, it will be as if you're running the whole VS Code instance on your local machine with all the extensions installed, even though those extensions are really installed inside the container. So this is the extension that helps you to kind of do that seamless development, of the code that is inside a container. So install this extension called remote containers, that is for VS Code. I have already installed Docker long time back. So if you just install Docker desktop, and it might prompt you to restart your machine. So restart your machine, confirm that the Docker desktop client is running. So if you just hover over the Docker desktop icon, it says it's running. So it's running. So after you confirm that, you have also installed the remote desktop extension for VS Code. Once you do both of them, you will get this icon on the bottom left of VS Code. That is the icon for remote containers. Click on that, and then you can just say add development container configuration files. So now it is going to ask you what kind of container do you want to develop in. So now it's a time to search for it. I'm just going to search, I want to develop for on a node. So you need to say show all definitions. You might have something for Azure functions as well. So I'm going to say Azure functions and node 12. That is the container that I'm going to use. So now straight away I get a prompt on the bottom right. It says folder contains dev container configuration file. Reopen the folder to develop in a container. So I say yes, reopen inside a container. So now the magic happens. Now it's going to start building the container. If you are not using a WSL2 setting on the Docker, it might take a bit more time for you to build the container. So after the container is built, you'll get this thing on the bottom right which says I'm using this Azure function and Node.js 12 container. So I'm going to first change the name of this container. I'm going to say this is Azure Static Web App container. So after I do that, I can just click on it and say rebuild container, and now it's gonna start rebuild. So it has rebuilt the container, and now what I need to do is I need to start installing some extensions on the container itself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to search for GitHub actions. GitHub actions. GitHub actions. So this is the one. I'm going to say right click on it and say add to dev container.json. and then install on dev container. And then I'm just gonna reload. So if I go and check my container.json, you can see that it has added that extension to the dev container JSON configuration file. Another extension I need to install is Azure Static Web Apps. So that is one, Azure Static Web Apps. This is in preview. I'm going to say install on dev containers. I say reload. And if I go and check, I say it didn't see. If I say install on dev containers without adding it, it won't add that. It won't add that extension to the dev containers JSON config. So you also need to add that to the dev container. So I'm going to search again this one, Azure Static Web Apps preview. Right click on it, add to dev container.json. And now if I go and check the dev container.json, it's already there. So you have installed both the extensions. One is for GitHub Actions, and another is for the static web apps. Now we need the third extension, that is the live server. So I'm going to install this live server. What this live server extension is just runs a local server, so that you don't need to host it in any IaaS or anything like that. So you need that. So same as before, right click, add to dev containers JSON, install in dev containers, and then you should be able to reload the page, and then you will have all the three extensions installed. So these are, so we have the two areas. One, so if you close this recommended, you have one that says these are the extensions installed locally, that is on my host machine, and these are the extensions that are installed on the container. So we have installed GitHub Actions. This ESLint was already installed when we provisioned the container, as well as these Azure functions, Azure account, all these are already installed for us. So we just installed three extensions. Now we are ready to kickstart our development process. So after installing the extensions on the container, let's go and create a new static web app. So click on the Azure icon. You have one for functions, because the container itself was provisioned from a functions image. And first step, you need to sign into Azure. Click sign into Azure, and then you'll get a new pop-up. You need to sign into your Azure account. So now I have signed into Azure. I can close this window. So if I go back, so I have signed into my Azure, and now I need to create a new static web app. So what is the name of static web app? So I say YouTube static web app. Choose an organization. This is when you might be prompted to give permission to your GitHub repo. Since I have already given permission, I am just going to choose my organization. Otherwise you might be taken to GitHub, and then you'll be prompted to actually give permission to Azure. And I'm going to create a new GitHub repository. I'm just going to call it YouTube Azure SWA demo. So where is going to be your application code? I'm just going to say my application code is going to be in a folder called app. So I'm going to just say /app. Where is going to be the API? I'm just going to say it's going to be in the API. I'm going to accept the default. Build. Where is going to be a build? Since I'm not going to be really building anything, since I'm going to be just using a vanilla HTML, which just calls a API using fetch I don't have a build step, so I don't need this. So I'm gonna delete that and press enter. Right now, since this Azure Static Web App is in preview, you don't have all the Azure regions. So I'm going to choose the one that is closest to me, which is East Asia, and it's going to start provisioning the resources. So let's wait for that to finish. So now you can see successfully created static web app. So it has finished the it has actually provisioned the resource on Azure. So now if I go into Azure Static Web App, expand this. So this is a different one. I'm gonna say expand this YouTube Static Web App. It's got already production, and if you see, there is a continuous integration action that is already started to run. So it is already started to run and it's finished this step. So this is, in order to get the detail of this, if I double click on this, I'm double clicking on this, and I'm not getting any sort of response or any sort of tab from this particular job. So that's the reason I installed this other extension, that is the GitHub action extensions. So right now when you try to click on this, so the GitHub actions has got this play button. So if you click on this, you'll get this error has occurred. Let's create a new folder called new folder in root. I need to create it in root called, I'm going to call that app. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new file underneath it. I'm going to call it index.html. So then I'm going to use emmet expansions. So I put an exclamation mark and then I tab. So it's going to fill that in. I'm going to say this is hello. So I'm going to say h2 hello from Azure SWA. I'm going to save it. I now need to commit my changes to the GitHub repo that was created by the Azure Static Web Apps extension. So first thing, I need to initialize the Git repo. Say git init. So the Git repo is initialized. Next, I need to set the remote. So I am going to say git remote add origin. So this is the remote. So if I go into the thing, you can see that it has created the Azure Static Web Apps extension, created this repo on my GitHub. So I just need to set that up. And then I just want to confirm that git remote -v. So that is definitely the remote. So next step, I'm just going to do a git fetch. So it did fetch the remote changes. So I'm going to commit this change into my local git. Say initial commit. I'm going to commit these changes. So now if I try to do a git pull, I get an error saying that this is actually I need to set this set upstream to. So I'm gonna set that set upstream to origin master. So the local master I have, I'm going to set that to origin master. So branch master is now tracking the remote master. Now if I do a git pull, still it's saying that I can't merge unrelated histories. So I'm going to force it to merge unrelated histories. So I'm going to say git pull origin master, allow unrelated histories. So now it is giving me this log. I'm going to say merge. So I'm just not going to use this part. I'm just going to use the extension. So I say merge master. I'm just going to commit this. I'm going to exit out of this, Control X. And now I'm going to push this to my GitHub repo. So it's pushing it. So after I did this allow unrelated histories, I did a git pull and I did a git push. So now I just pushed everything into the repo. So let's check the static web apps extension. If you don't want to go through this sort of painful process, the other easy option is you basically can clone the repo. So basically what you can do is clone the repo that static web apps created. So we go to code, clone this repo and then add your app folder to that repo. So that would be a lot easier than just probably running this series of commands. So I'm going to check my static web apps, YouTube static web app, see whether it is running anything. So it is running. So that was the first one in the bottom. This is the second one. It is starting to build. Now if I go and check the GitHub actions, so you can see it is the first one build. So this was the very first one I ran, it failed. This is the latest one. It actually succeeded. Now if I double click on this build and deploy node, towards the very bottom you can see this is the URL, Blue Beach. So if I just click on it, I just say open. So this is hello from static web app. So if I go into the index, hello from Azure Static Web App, so that's what we created. And if I go into my repo and then check the actions, see it has basically run the same action. So now we have a live site. We just have HTML, we don't have any API, but it is up and running. We have now deployed the static web app to Azure. So how do we test this particular HTML page locally? If you just open it on the browser, that's gonna work fine if you don't have any API calls. Once you have, because the next step is to add the API. But if you have an API, then this whole opening in the browser won't work. So how do we kind of test this locally? So we need to, for that purpose, we have this other extension called live server. So that is the extension here. We have installed it on the config when we set up the dev containers. So in the dev containers config, we have this extension called live server. So if I now go into my extension, I can see that it is installed. So let me just try to, how do I open this page on live server? After you install live server, you get this on the bottom right, you have this option called go live. I'm going to click on this go live. So it's saying that the live server is running on port 5500. So if I just go into port 5500 localhost port 5500, nothing seems to be happening at the moment. That is because I have to add that port into the forward ports and dev containers. So 7071 is where Azure you have the functions. That's a port when functions listens on. So we need to add port 5500 to that list as well. So after I do that, I just need to rebuild my container. So if I go into dev container on the bottom left, I just say rebuild container. So it's gonna open the whole thing again. So the container is now rebuilt. So I can click on this go live again. Now it's saying it started on port 5500. Now let me try it one more time. Localhost 5500. Say it's able to load. So localhost 5500 app, and then that's the index.html. So it is able to load that index.html page. So now we have a working live server setup.